What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back with another one of my top 10 videos, and today I'm going to be tackling the subject of remakes because I spend a lot of time on this channel criticizing filmmakers for their lack of originality or their creative bankruptcy or just second-rate storytellers who take something that used to be cool and turn it into something that is not. That's more often the problem than anything. But I feel like it's useful every once in a while to play a little devil's advocate and argue against yourself, because as much as I despise remakes, every once in a while there's a really good one, so much so that it completely eclipses what came before and becomes a new classic. And a lot of these remakes I'm going to be discussing in today's video I saw before the original. But my rule is going to be, in order to be included on this list, I have to have seen the original film upon which it's based so I can do a proper compare and contrast. And another thing to keep in mind is, when is a remake not a remake? Like, at what point is it a fresh adaptation of source material? Like, take, for instance, True Grit, starring John Wayne. Really good movie. And then the Coen brothers came along decades later and did True Grit again, but they kept calling attention to the fact that it was a fresh adaptation, not a remake. And I'm going to take them at their word, because a fresh adaptation of the same source material is a very different endeavor than taking a movie that's great and trying to recreate it for a different generation. Or, as is often the case with the best remakes from my childhood, remakes from the 80s oftentimes would take a science fiction or horror classic from the 40s or 50s and then open it up and show things to us that could never be seen in those previous eras. And I feel like that's when a remake gets really exciting, when you really take it to the dark side and really just freak people the fuck out, or turn them on in ways that would have been frowned upon in earlier eras. I feel like where remakes really get into trouble is when they take something great and then defang it, declaw it, dilute it, wreck it, like Total Recall or RoboCop or anything along those lines, where you take a movie that was originally a hard R by an iconoclastic director like Paul Verhoeven and turn it into just mainstream fluff for the whole family. But as I was cooking up my list of contenders for this list, what shocked me was how quickly I came up with 20 contenders, just like that, like in less than a minute. So maybe I don't mind remakes as much as I claim. I guess I just hate shitty remakes, and most remakes are fucking shitty, but some of them are good. But let me go ahead and give out a few honorable mentions that will not be making the list, just to get this out of the way. But these are remakes that I really admire. Star is Born. That movie gets remade every couple of decades, and all of them are worth seeing. Magnificent Seven, which is a remake of The Seven Samurai. Cape Fear, which is a remake of Cape Fear. The Blob, which is a personal fave and really fucked me up as a kid. That's a fantastic remake. Man Who Knew Too Much. I mean, Hitchcock remade his own movie. Some people would even say that North by Northwest is a remake of The 39 Steps. Birdcage, another good one. The Departed. A lot of fans of the original Infernal Affairs really hate The Departed, but I saw The Departed first and I like it. Little Shop of Horrors, maybe my favorite movie musical that I've ever seen, based on the original Roger Corman with Jack Nicholson, but yeah, that fucking rules. 12 Monkeys, astonishing remake of Chris Marker's Les Jetés, if I'm saying that correctly, but that short film famously only uses still frames except for one shot where somebody's eye blinks. And of course, the movie 12 Monkeys has been remade or adapted into a TV show. That concept's not going away anytime soon. Some Like It Hot might have made my list. However, I've not seen the original movie that it's based upon, but Some Like It Hot, one of the funniest movies of the 1950s. The Maltese Falcon, one of Humphrey Bogart's best films. I've not seen the original Maltese Falcon, but I have seen, obviously, the John Huston film many times over. And occasionally we even get art house remakes like Ali Fear Eats the Soul, which is Rainer Werner Fassbinder's remake of All That Heaven Allows from Douglas Sirk. So whether you're talking about big franchises, art house movies, classic movies, remakes have always been around and they always will be. But maybe we should start slipping into my official top 10, and let's start with a movie that completely, totally traumatized me as a kid. Philip Kaufman's Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1978. Now, with this movie, I'm already going to get myself into trouble, because is it a remake of the Don Siegel classic from 1956, or is it a fresh adaptation of the novel from 1955 called The Body Snatchers by Jack Finney? I have not read the book, so I can't really say, and I probably should have done a little more homework before getting started. For the sake of my list, I'm just going to say it's a remake because it includes actors as well as the director of the original in the film. I mean, Don Siegel makes a cameo as a cab driver, and obviously we get a recreation of the iconic scene with Kevin McCarthy, who was just so dynamic and so incredible in the original film. And that scene is so intense in the remake that a lot of people have gone so far as to say that this is actually the official sequel to the 1956 original film. And I think it works either way, but anytime you have a science fiction film that unites Jeff Goldblum and Spock in the same science fiction film, you're already off to the races. But what makes this movie particularly intense compared to the original is that it actually includes nudity. I mean, I can remember as a little kid watching the scene where Brooke Adams basically like shrivels up and gets turned into one of the pod people and starts strutting around naked, and I was so confused and so horrified. It really got to me. And obviously there are a few shots in the horror genre that are as effective and intense as that final shot of Donald Sutherland. But what makes this and the original such enduring classics is that there are times where it does feel like the pod people are taking over. We live in an era where we have all these weird little tribes that form online where people talk alike, they think alike, they act alike. And for my money, I always want to say to all the tribes out there, go fuck yourselves. Everybody should aspire to be a tribe of one. But let's move on to my number 9, Nosferatu Phantom der Nacht. I'm actually wearing the t-shirt for Werner Herzog's 1979 remake of the original 1922 classic by F.W. Murnau. And Werner Herzog maintains that the original is still the greatest of all German films. It's 100 years old at this point. And I love the original. I think it was the first silent film that I ever saw, and I watched it over and over and over again. But I love Werner Herzog's film as well. I mean, obviously, anytime you have Klaus Kinski and Isabelle Adjani in the same movie, that's worth looking at. But what really gets me about this movie is how Herzog employs music by Wagner to create this atmosphere of dread and terror. And there are sequences early on where the music starts to swell as Jonathan Harker is making his way to the castle of the vampire that just floor me each and every single time I watch it. Most Dracula movies that are loosely based on Bram Stoker's original, they tend to thrive during all the Jonathan Harker sequences, and this movie is no exception. But I feel like a lot of people, when they think of Werner Herzog, they always think of his documentaries. And he's made so many great documentaries. I think that's totally fair. Or they think about all the crazy, larger-than-life stunts that he basically put his body through in order to make his movies. And there was one small stunt that he did on this movie where he allowed his toe to be bitten by a large rat for one shot. But this movie really shows that he can do genre and do it well. He can do style. He can do atmosphere. He can do mood. And I just really dig it. And it also shows what you can do with a small crew. I mean, he had a crew of 16 people, and that's twice as many people as he had for Agira, the Wrath of God. But Herzog and Kinski, they're one of the great filmmaking duos of all film history, and all of their collaborations are absolutely worth hunting down. But let's push on to my number 8, Heat from 1995. And Heat's a strange beast where it's one of the only franchises that's gone from TV movie to theatrical movie to best-selling fiction with Heat 2. But I saw the remake first, like most people, the classic film from 1995. But if you watch LA Takedown from 1989, it has almost the exact same shooting script, but with the movie, they just fleshed it out, made it more epic, they made it bigger, they gave it more character, and obviously shot it in a much more gorgeous, dynamic fashion. It just shows what 6 months of pre-production and a 117-day shooting schedule can give you, whereas LA Takedown had 10 days of pre-production and a 19-day shooting schedule. And Michael Mann himself said that comparing one film to the other is like comparing freeze-dried coffee to Jamaican Blue Mountain. And I think that's totally fair. But it's interesting seeing how Xander Berkeley is the only actor who made it from one to the next. But what can I say about Heat that hasn't already been said, or hasn't already been said by me in my review for Heat 2, which I posted back in August? It's one of the great crime sagas, and it's one of the great crime sagas with an astonishing ensemble cast. And while it's a total cliche to compliment it in this fashion, it gets better each and every single time I see it. So if you have not revisited Heat in a good long while, go back and check it out. But number 7, William Friedkin's Sorcerer from 1977, a remake of The Wages of Fear from 1953. William Friedkin's film was a notorious flop because it had the misfortune of opening up against a movie that you might have heard of, a little movie called Star Wars. But I think that Sorcerer might have failed no matter what, because this is one of those uncompromising, just relentless, ruthless movies that makes almost no commercial concessions for the audience. And it's a nightmarish experience. And there are some people out there like Quentin Tarantino who say that they prefer Sorcerer to the original film by Henry George Clouzot. And let's not get crazy. I mean, I think Henry George Clouzot's film is a one-of-a-kind masterpiece, but Sorcerer is absolutely riveting. And as far as the movie being a commercial failure is concerned, I think it made a few major mistakes. And maybe those mistakes are what make it so relentless and so intense, but I think it had an overly long intro of all the characters. Even though the movie's 10 minutes shorter than the original Wages of Fear, it just makes the movie feel a hell of a lot longer. But I feel like all those scenes could have been part of a completely different but very cool crime film. But I think the movie's name is also totally absurd. It's one of the names of the trucks involved in the story. Sorcerer, I mean, Americans, they like their titles to be straightforward, and calling it Sorcerer sets up very strange expectations. But the crew went through hell making this film. Apparently, about 50 members of the crew had to leave the film due to injury and/or gangrene and food poisoning and malaria. I mean, this was pure hell to film, and in a lot of ways, it's pure hell to watch. It's not fun to watch, but it's overwhelming, and I find it fascinating, and particularly the bridge sequence, which was so technically complex to shoot. It took 3 months just to shoot that one scene. But even if you find the film to be too grim to be enjoyed, you gotta watch it to hear the awe-inspiring score by Tangerine Dream, or at a minimum, check out the brilliant homage poster by the great Tony Stella. But my first exposure to it came in the best possible way, because after decades of the film being unavailable due to all kinds of complicated legal issues, it was finally restored and re-released. I saw it at the Film Forum Theater here in New York, only a couple blocks away, and I just found it to be like one of the sweatiest, wettest, most humid, disgusting films ever made, and I couldn't take my eyes off it. But just to give you an idea of what a failure was, it cost $21 million to make, and it grossed $9. No bueno, but thankfully now the movie is available and can be rediscovered by a whole new generation. But let's push on to my number 6. Cat People from 1982, Paul Schrader's remake of Jacques Tourneur's 1942 classic. This is one of those movies I was referring to at the beginning of the video, where the remake allowed them to explore all the sexuality that was totally kind of beneath the surface. It was the subtext of the original film, and this movie just takes that subtext and just rips it wide open. And I saw Jacques Tourneur's film first, which uses this great kind of supernatural sleight of hand storytelling where they didn't have the budget to do the special effects that they wanted, so they had to basically employ a lot of shadow play and suggestion to achieve the horror effects they wanted. But also in 1942, making a movie about a girl's sexual awakening was strictly verboten. But this movie, Paul Schrader just went for it. He notoriously had an affair with his lead actress, Nastasia Kinski, while making it, where apparently he fell in love with her and proposed marriage, whereupon she completely disappeared and just told him, "Paul, I always fuck my directors, and with you, it was difficult." But Cat People is just atmospheric as hell. It's got great David Bowie music. It has an astonishing score by Giorgio Moroder. It's got tons of nudity. I mean, Odette O'Toole, one of my big childhood crushes. There's an astonishing pool sequence in this film that has to be seen to be believed. But this movie is just wild, it's ruthless, it's gory, and it's the definition of a great 80s remake of a 1940s classic. However, for my number 5, we have a great 80s remake of a 1950s classic with David Cronenberg's The Fly, which is a remake of the original from 1958. This was the first film by David Cronenberg that I ever saw, and I loved it so much that it prompted me to go back and watch the original. Maybe this is the first example of me going back and hunting down what for me felt like a movie from a bygone era, because I was like 10 or 11. I mean, I did not sit around watching movies from the 1950s at that time. But I think what really makes this movie shine is that it's an incredibly powerful love story between Jeff Goldblum and Gina Davis. That aspect really works so that the movie turns into this great tragedy in addition to being one of the definitive body horror films out there. And there was a great interview with Vincent Price in 1987 where he says that Jeff Goldblum wrote him a letter saying, "I hope you like it as much as I liked yours." And Vincent Price apparently was so touched, he wrote a reply and said, "Wonderful right up to a certain point, ... It went a little too far." But in addition to the tragic love story and the astonishing horror sequences, it also has a really good screenplay, like great lines like, "I'm saying I'm an insect who dreamt he was a man and loved it, but now that dream is over and the insect is awake." That was just so ominous and so terrifying. It makes you wonder what would happen to the world if insects were a little bit bigger. And there are tons of ways to interpret this film because David Cronenberg says he regards it as a metaphor for the aging process or terminal diseases and how they make people almost unrecognizable to their loved ones and the horror it can put your loved ones through and how it's so dehumanizing. But some people have interpreted it as a metaphor for the AIDS epidemic. And, it's a film. You can interpret it however you like. But I also find it interesting that David Cronenberg bailed on doing Total Recall in order to do this. So I feel like we kind of got the best of both worlds, where David Cronenberg got to do The Fly and Paul Verhoeven got to do Total Recall, two films that I absolutely love. But one final thing about this is it's one of the great movies produced by Mel Brooks. And Mel Brooks doesn't get enough credit as a producer. Obviously, brilliant writer, brilliant performer, brilliant director. But he produced a lot of movies like The Elephant Man and The Fly. So shout out to Mel Brooks for making this movie happen. But let's get into the nitty-gritty with perhaps the most famous remake ever made, John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982, which is a remake of The Thing from Another World from 1951, a film that was officially directed by Christian Nyby, but kind of unofficially directed by Howard Hawks, who produced the film. And Howard Hawks is one of my favorite filmmakers, and he'll be coming up later in this video. But I listened to the audio commentary once of John Carpenter watching the original movie, and I think he was like 7 or 8 when he first saw it. And what was incredible is how initially in the commentary, he's talking, he's talking a mile a minute, but at a certain point, he stops talking entirely, and you suddenly realize, oh, John Carpenter's just watching the movie. Like, he's gone back to that special place in all of us where you're still a kid, and he's just eating it up. But some people might argue that this movie is less a remake and more of a fresh adaptation of the classic short story Who Goes There by science fiction author John W. Campbell Jr., and I've read that story, and it's fascinating. If you want to say it's a fresh adaptation, great. If you want to say it's a remake, great. But obviously, when it comes to the monster, it's a complete reimagining of the monster from the ground up for this film, where 22-year-old Rob Bottin stepped in and basically worked himself to death. He had to be admitted to a hospital at one point. But what he achieved is a landmark in practical special effects that might not ever be outdone in any other movie, but I first saw this movie as part of a double bill at my uncle's place. My uncle liked putting on double features. He had a Laserdisc player and a big pull-down screen. And he and my dad loved to watch this and the Walter Hill film The Warriors. And I can remember watching The Thing. Maybe I was 6 or 7 at the time. And it was one of the first truly nightmarish out-of-body experiences where the horror was so unimaginable that I couldn't even really process it or internalize it or put it into words because I couldn't even understand what the fuck was happening, which really made the movie just loom large in my imagination for a long time as like this beast that I had to wrestle with and come to terms with. And then as I got a little older and started revisiting the movie, well, then it started climbing to the top of one of my all-time favorite science fiction and/or horror movies. But if you ever want to do a little experiment where your opinion of film critics will reach a new low, go back and look at some of the reviews of this film from the summer of 1982, whether you're talking about people like Vincent Canby or Roger Ebert. It's incredible just how frequently film critics overlook masterpieces at the time they're released. This is the same summer that Blade Runner came out and also underperformed. If you have The Thing and Blade Runner both underperforming in the same summer, well, something's dreadfully wrong. Some people will say, well, E.T. just kind of change what people are in the mood for that summer, but I think that's total bullshit. A movie like E.T. can do well alongside other movies, especially when you have Kurt Russell and one of the best ensemble casts ever assembled, just hitting one home run after another. The way they work off one another, the atmosphere of paranoia that they create as a group, It's really special. And Ennio Morricone, it's one of the great, simple, effective horror scores where the score is just like a pulse. It is one of a kind, so much so that Tarantino used some outtakes from it years later in his film The Hateful Eight. But John Carpenter, he refers to this as the first of his Apocalypse trilogy, an unofficial trilogy which includes Prince of Darkness from 1987 and In the Mouth of Madness from 1994. The trilogy is fantastic, but The Thing is the real classic of all those films. Now, I have to pause for a second and point something out. Not only did the last movie give me a chance to give a shout out to one of my all-time favorite filmmakers, Howard Hawks, the next two choices also give me the same opportunity, because with my number 3, you have the Howard Hawks film His Girl Friday, which is a remake of The Front Page from 1931. But with my number 2, we have the 1983 Scarface, Brian De Palma's remake of Howard Hawks' 1932 film of the same name, Scarface. And I didn't plan it this way, but somehow movies by Howard Hawks came up in 3 picks in a row. So it just shows that when it comes to directors who have their fingers on the pulse of great genre entertainment, Howard Hawks is one of the greatest who ever did it. And one of these days, I will get off my ass and do a top 10 Howard Hawks video. But for now, let's focus on my number 3, His Girl Friday from 1940. I actually went back and saw The Front Page for the first time just so I could include His Girl Friday in this video. And what got me off guard was just how much I loved The Front Page. I mean, if you like pre-code Hollywood movies, really gritty, gnarly dramas that pull no punches, and it's a brief little era in Hollywood history where censorship was relatively light, but there's no getting around the fact that His Girl Friday is one of the fastest, sharpest, cleverest romantic comedies ever conceived by human beings.
Just don't love
Oh,
you.
now that isn't true. Just because you won't listen, you say I don't love you. Now you know that isn't the point at all.
What else
The
have you
point
got
is that
lined
you
up?
never intended to be decent and live like a human being.
What's that?
All right, if that's the way you want to
it's
think.
Sebastian
I see
jumping.
what you
I'm
are
trying to
now.
concentrate.
You're just like him and all the rest.
Sure, that's what I am.
What? No, leave the rooster story alone. That's human interest.
And obviously the stars Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell and director Howard Hawks had a lot to do with that. But what it all boils down to is superb writing, which came originally in the form of the 1928 play, The Front Page by Ben Hecht and Charles MacArthur. If you don't know who Ben Hecht is, look him up on IMDb. But for a couple of decades, he was one of the best and one of the highest paid writers in Hollywood. He had his name attached to so many astonishing classics from the 30s and 40s. And what really differentiates this from the original is how they did a little gender bending, where, according to the legend, and Howard Hawks, he was a notorious liar in a lot of ways. I love him, but he was a notorious liar, and he would tell these stories that would become myth, and these myths would turn into legend, and they would just get repeated, till they became part of like the fabric of Hollywood history. But supposedly they were running lines and reading the script, and Howard Hawks realized, well, goddamn, like this sounds a lot better when you have one part being played by a woman. So in steps Rosalind Russell, maybe the most famous example of gender bending in Hollywood history and really making it work and thrive. And the movie employs a special technique or trick which makes the film seem even faster, where they very deliberately wrote the script in a way where whenever somebody has a line of dialogue, if they're arguing with somebody, the first few words in their line and the last few words wouldn't really matter that much, because they wanted people to be able to interrupt and talk over each other. And that overlapping dialogue just makes the dialogue feel almost like a fire hose being blasted in your face, and it really works well. And I know sometimes people complain about my podcast Wrong and Real about how I interrupt people too much, but I'm just trying to recreate that Hawksian overlapping dialogue. Or maybe I just interrupt people too much. But it's incredible just how much of the script of The Front Page is identical to His Girl Friday, even though The Front Page, while humorous at times, is not an outright romantic comedy in the same way His Girl Friday is. So it just shows how, in the hands of different actors, a different filmmaker, and a slightly different approach, a really riveting newspaper drama can become just a delightful, sparkling comedy. But let's move on to my number 2. I already mentioned it. Brian De Palma's 1983 remake of Scarface, remaking the original 1932 classic by Howard Hawks and basically taking the booze biz in Chicago and Prohibition era and turning it into cocaine in Miami. Although it's not even Miami, they basically had to shoot it in LA because a lot of people in Miami were protesting the depiction of this culture in Miami. So apart from a few exteriors, this is an LA-based movie. But in contrast to the original, where we have Paul Muni basically playing Al Capone in Chicago, a Prohibition-era gangster story, we now have Al Pacino playing Tony Montana. And it's funny how he's only called Scarface one time in the movie, and that time is in Spanish when he's referred to as Cara Cicatriz. but goddamn, I saw this movie probably 10 or 15 times before I ever saw the original, and as much as I love Howard Hawks, I don't regard Scarface as one of Howard Hawks' strongest movies. I mean, it's in my top 10, but it's just not like in the top 3. But Scarface is a strong contender for one of Brian De Palma's best movies. And it didn't even start out as a Brian De Palma film. It was actually Sidney Lumet who first had the idea of setting the film in Miami with Cubans. But for reasons that are too complicated to get into right now, Sidney Lumet ended up going off and doing Prince of the City, and instead Brian De Palma ended up stepping in. He dropped out of the movie Flashdance, which was a huge hit for Adrian Lyne, to direct this, so he might have regretted dropping out of a monster hit. However, he gave us one of his best movies, and it was on this film where Brian De Palma waged one of his most violent battles with the censorship of the MPAA, where they kept giving the film an X, and he kept pulling out violence, and they kept slapping an X on it. And so finally he just said, all right, well, it's all X to me, and he put all the original footage back in.
And it kept on getting X's, and then I said, absolutely, I'm not changing it anymore. And what I did that really drove the mold crazy is that I put everything back in. It's all X to me.
And Brian De Palma stuck by his guns. That decision was eventually appealed, and the movie got an R rating. But by the mid-90s, when I discovered it on VHS, my friends, it was a genuine, bona fide cult classic. And now it's one of the most beloved films of the 1980s. But let's move on to my number 1, which gives me an opportunity to celebrate both Sergio Leone as well as Akira Kurosawa, two of the greatest filmmakers who have ever lived. And of course, I'm talking about A Fistful of Dollars from 1964, which is a remake of Yojimbo from 1961, but there was a catch. Sergio Leone didn't bother securing the rights to the original film. Lawyers got involved, and Akira Kurosawa ended up making quite a bit of money off A Fistful of Dollars, which became a bona fide worldwide smash. But it took a little while before it got a release in America. But this is one of those movies that reminds me that it's always a good idea to have no hard rules about filmmaking, where ordinarily, I say, when you make an English language remake of a foreign film, immediately after its release, well, you should just resist and oppose that remake with every ounce of your being, like when Let the Right One In was immediately remade as Let Me In. I just thought that was gross. But I love the fact that A Fistful of Dollars exists, and it obviously led to a few dollars more and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It's one of the all-time great unofficial trilogies, and people call it the Man with No Name trilogy. But Clint Eastwood's character is called Joe in this movie, so people should call it the Man with No Name trilogy, but sometimes called Joe or something along those lines. But at the time this movie was made, Clint Eastwood had a contract with the show Rawhide where he couldn't make any movies in the U.S. However, he could accept movie assignments over in Europe. So he went over to Europe to make this movie, and he talked about how they had no electricity, they didn't have a trailer with a toilet, they just went out and did their business behind rocks. But his gamble absolutely paid off, because I think this is one of the most influential pieces of genre entertainment ever made. From the moment the movie starts, just that title sequence with the black, red, and white animation to the Ennio Morricone music, and I believe this was the first time that Ennio Morricone and Sergio Leone worked together. But from the moment the credits begin, you're like, oh, this is something totally different that we have never seen before. And it basically helped popularize and influence an entire subgenre of filmmaking, spaghetti westerns. Sergio Leone was not the only person making spaghetti westerns, but he obviously was the most famous. But that style, that tone, that flavor, nothing like that had ever been seen before, especially in America, where they had all these weird rules about how you couldn't fire a gun and show it hitting something in the same shot. But this movie opens up where you have a guy kicking a child and shooting his gun at his feet, and you're like, oh my God. At any rate, it's a thing of beauty. It makes me laugh every time. And just hearing like Clint Eastwood saying things like, get 3 coffins ready, going off and having his little battle, and then coming back and saying, my mistake, 4 coffins. It's very special. So in closing, I just want to say that it's important to have no hard and fast rules about filmmaking. As much as I despise most remakes, as much as I'm disgusted by the way a lot of franchises from my childhood are handled these days, you should always keep an open mind. And Frank Capra very famously said, there are no rules in filmmaking, only sins. And the cardinal sin is dullness. And I think that really gets to the root of the issue. So many remakes are dull as shit, which is why people have such a bad taste in their mouth about remakes. So I guess I just want to say that no matter how much I might be kind of dogmatic or get up on my high horse about remakes sometimes. This is my way of kind of poking fun at the fact that no matter how much film fans might like to get up on their high horse and issue decrees, like the old expression goes, often wrong but never in doubt. But it's important every once in a while to kind of, and like a proper debater, take the opposing side's point of view and point out the flaws in whatever your hypothesis or argument might be. But I hope you enjoyed this video. But before I go, I have to bring you an important message from Manscaped, the official sponsor of my podcast, Wrong Reel. The Christmas season is right around the corner, and I hope you'll consider supporting this channel or my podcast by making a purchase. But this holiday season, I'll be giving thanks to our friends over at Manscaped. Everyone loves turkey and stuffing, but you'll be looking like dessert with the help of Manscaped's Performance Package 4.0. The leaders in below-the-waist grooming have blessed you with the ultimate Thanksgiving dinner topic. Tell your in-laws about your new cutting-edge ball trimmer and gift yourself or the man in your life the ultimate men's hygiene bundle. Trim your pumpkins by going to manscaped.com and using the discount code WRONGREEL in all caps for free shipping and 20% off. Inside, you'll find the Lawnmower 4.0 trimmer, Weed Whacker ear and nose hair trimmer, Crop Preserver ball deodorant, Crop Reviver toner, Performance boxer briefs, and a travel bag to hold your goodies. Think of it as a cornucopia for your balls. So thank you so much for listening to my rant. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. And if you want to talk to me more, hunt me down on Twitter at Geeking Out. But hope everyone has a great week. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.